Welcome back. Tonight, we're going to step into one of the bloodiest and most shocking moments of the American Civil War, the Battle of Shiloh, a bloody turning point in the Western theater. It began with a surprise attack at dawn, deep in the Tennessee wilderness, where green Union soldiers were jolted from their tents by the sound of musket fire and Confederate battle cries. Over 2 days in April 1862, more than 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. A number that stunned the nation and shattered any illusion that the war would be short or simple. In this story, we'll uncover how General Grant nearly lost everything, how General Johnston died leading from the front, and how a muddy patch of land named after a small log church became a symbol of sacrifice and turning tides. This is not just a battle story. It's a haunting reminder of how quickly chaos can shape history. But before we continue, I'd like you to take a moment and let me know. Where are you watching from? What time is it for you? And are you listening to fall asleep or just killing time while learning a little history? And if you enjoy the stories I tell, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps me create more content just like this. Let's begin. The road to Shiloh began with rivers. In the early months of 1862, while most eyes in the divided United States were focused on battles in the East, something crucial was unfolding farther west, in muddy river valleys and thick forests, far from the polished halls of Washington or Richmond. The Western theater, often overlooked, would become a proving ground. Here, rivers weren't just geography, they were lifelines, highways of invasion, and arteries of control. And at the center of it all stood a man whose name few respected yet, Ulysses S. Grant. It had only been weeks since his aggressive, almost reckless campaigns at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson had shocked Confederate defenders. With the fall of those two forts in February, the Union suddenly had a clear path into the heart of Tennessee. Confederate lines buckled. Thousands of Southern soldiers surrendered, the largest capture of troops in American history up to that point. Newspapers in the North hailed the victories, and Grant, the quiet, rumpled officer from Ohio, became an overnight figure of interest. But not everyone trusted him. Even among Union leadership, some found Grant's methods unrefined. He wasn't polished. He didn't speak like a general. He rarely smiled, drank too much, and carried himself more like a farmer than a commander. But what he had, and what others soon realized, was an uncanny instinct for movement, momentum, and aggression. He didn't wait for perfect conditions. He advanced. By March, Grant's forces had pushed south along the Tennessee River, setting up camp near a place called Pittsburgh Landing. It was a quiet spot on the river's west bank, forested, remote, and not particularly well known outside of a nearby log church called Shiloh Meeting House. But its strategic importance was growing by the hour. Grant intended to use it as a staging area to unite with General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio, moving up from Nashville. Once combined, their two forces could march on Corinth, Mississippi, a vital rail hub and Confederate stronghold. Cutting it off would fracture Southern logistics in the West. But in the camp at Pittsburgh Landing, there was a creeping sense of overconfidence. Soldiers were mostly green, young men who'd never seen real combat. They drilled, cooked, played cards, and swapped letters with home. There were no trenches, no fortifications. Pickets were lax. Some units hadn't even been assigned proper defensive positions. The generals assumed the Confederates were in retreat. Grant himself had set up his headquarters several miles downriver at Savannah, Tennessee, leaving the army under the watch of generals like William T. Sherman and Benjamin Prentiss. But the Confederates weren't falling back. They were gathering. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston, a tall, dignified man with silver in his beard and steel in his eyes, had long been considered one of the South's best hopes in the Western theater. Jefferson Davis trusted him deeply, and Johnston knew that if he let Grant and Buell become forces at Pittsburgh Landing, it might be impossible to stop them. So he gambled. Together with General P.G.T. Beauregard, Johnston gathered roughly 40,000 Confederate troops near Corinth and began planning a surprise attack. The goal: strike Grant before Buell arrived. If they could crush the Union camp quickly enough, they might push the North entirely out of southwestern Tennessee. The plan wasn't without problems. The march north from Corinth was grueling. Roads turned to soup in the spring rain, and supply lines were patchy at best. It took them 3 full days to travel the roughly 20 miles to the edge of the Union camps. And then, just before the attack was set to begin, General Beauregard argued for retreat. He believed the element of surprise had been lost. Confederate soldiers had stumbled into Union scouts. Horses had given away their presence. The army was tired and disorganized, but Johnston refused to back down. He knew the odds were long. He knew his army was raw, and that some officers doubted the plan. But he also knew this was likely their only shot to stop the Union's momentum in the West. He overruled Beauregard. The attack would go forward at dawn. It's eerie, in hindsight, how unaware the Union army was of the danger just beyond the tree line. That night, as the Confederate troops slept on their arms in the forest, ready to strike, Union soldiers played cards around fires or wrote in their diaries about home. One wrote, "The days are getting warmer. We'll march soon, I think, but not for long. They say the Rebs are running." They weren't. One thing that always catches my attention about this moment in history is how much of it turned on misjudgment. Both sides were overconfident, but in different ways. The Union assumed they were in full control. The Confederates assumed they could win in a single blow. Neither truly understood the bloodbath that was coming. And that's part of what makes Shiloh so unsettling. It wasn't a battle fought by hardened veterans. It was a collision between armies still learning how to kill. The officers were often improvising. The soldiers were often terrified. There was no precedent yet for what this war was about to become. As the Confederate lines crept forward in the morning fog of April 6th, many soldiers thought they'd woken too early for drill. Some were still frying bacon. Some were still asleep. The woods were still. No birds, just mist and trees. And then, the first shots. The morning of April 6, 1862, arrived cloaked in an eerie stillness. A thin fog curled low over the Tennessee woods, as though the land itself were holding its breath. In the Union camps near Pittsburgh Landing, soldiers stirred lazily from their tents. Some were still half asleep, others bent over small fires, poking at pots of coffee, or frying bacon on blackened pans. There was no real sense of danger. The picket lines were thin, and no earthworks had been built. Officers had convinced themselves the enemy was too far away to launch an attack anytime soon. Then came a sound that did not belong to the quiet rhythm of camp life. A sudden rustling through the underbrush. The sharp crack of a musket. And then, like the tearing open of the very earth, a volley of Confederate gunfire ripped through the trees. Private Thomas D. Duncan of the 15th Iowa later wrote, "It was like the air turned solid. The sound hit me first, then the screaming. You didn't see them until they were right there, running, howling, like ghosts set on fire. It wasn't a skirmish. It was a full assault." General Albert Sidney Johnston had launched his army at dawn, pushing southward from Corinth in a desperate attempt to catch the Union forces off guard. And he succeeded. The Confederate army surged out of the tree line in a long, ragged formation, 3 corps deep, stacked one behind the other. Their alignment, stretched and poorly coordinated, caused confusion even among their own officers. But in that first hour, none of it mattered. The shock was enough. Soldiers from Sherman's and Prentice's divisions were still grabbing their rifles when the enemy came charging. Some didn't even have time for that. Men bolted from tents in their nightshirts, barefoot, stumbling into a wall of smoke and musket fire. The infamous rebel yell rang through the woods, an unearthly screech that Union veterans would never forget. It wasn't the stylized cry Hollywood later imagined. It was raw, high-pitched, more animal than human. Confederate soldiers screamed it as they charged, the sound feeding their own adrenaline and fraying the nerves of those they faced. Some Union soldiers broke immediately, scattering toward the river in a blind panic. Others tried to form lines amid the confusion. But with no clear orders, officers had to make decisions on instinct. Sherman, caught entirely by surprise, quickly grasped the magnitude of the situation. He had been skeptical that the enemy was even nearby just the day before. Now, bullets were snapping past his head, and men were dropping all around him. He reportedly took a bullet through the hand early in the fighting, but remained mounted, rallying his troops again and again. In his report, Sherman described the enemy as attacking furiously, boldly, and with such energy that my division was driven from its camps. He wasn't exaggerating. The first line of Union tents was completely overrun. Soldiers abandoned food, rifles, even boots, as they fled into the woods. The Confederate army surged forward like a tide through a shattered sandcastle. The terrain only added to the chaos. The rolling landscape, cut with ravines, tangled undergrowth and scattered trees, meant visibility was often no more than a few dozen yards. Entire regiments lost track of one another. Officers shouted in vain over the roar of gunfire. Horses panicked, and cannons were left behind, bogged in mud or captured in the rush. Still, not everything fell apart. In the center and to the left, parts of the Union line began to resist. Colonel Everett Peabody, sensing danger the night before, had ordered a reconnaissance mission before dawn. That small patrol was the first to encounter the Confederate vanguard and was wiped out nearly to a man. But their sacrifice gave Peabody precious minutes to form a hasty defense. For a brief time, his men held, exchanging volleys at close range. It wasn't enough to stop the Confederate advance, but it slowed it just enough to begin buying time. Further down the line, General Benjamin Prentiss began organizing a stiffer resistance. His brigade, joined later by other scattered units, would soon become the core of the infamous Hornet's Nest. But at this hour, the battlefield was a mess of individual heroism and widespread confusion. Grant, meanwhile, was not even at the front when the assault began. He had been staying several miles upriver in Savannah, Tennessee, nursing an injured leg from a fall off his horse. When the first reports came in, he boarded a steamboat and raced downstream, arriving as the magnitude of the attack became clear. He would spend much of the day moving between positions, mostly on horseback despite the pain in his leg, refusing to panic. It's worth pausing here, just for a moment, to consider what it must have felt like, not just for the generals with maps and dispatch riders, but for the thousands of boys barely out of adolescence, shoved awake by screams, grabbing rifles in trembling hands, watching friends drop beside them before they could even fire a shot. The birds didn't sing that morning. The air was thick with smoke, and the only rhythm came from drum beats, shouts, and the thudding report of cannon fire rolling across the forest. Some Confederate officers noticed that their men began looting the Union camps as they advanced. Food, boots, even whiskey was stolen from abandoned tents. This lapse in discipline cost them momentum. Precious time was wasted on plunder, when they could have pushed harder, deeper into the Union line. And all the while, every minute counted. Back in the rear, surgeons prepared makeshift hospitals, under trees, or in tents hastily converted into operating rooms. Amputation saws were readied, and stretchers lined the paths down to the river. The wounded already poured in, many with wounds too horrific to describe. There was no real anesthesia, just chloroform when it was available, or a swig of whiskey and something to bite down on. For many, it wasn't enough. The Hornet's Nest was never meant to be a battlefield. It was just a tangled patch of undergrowth, dense with oaks and sweet gum trees, the ground uneven and half-shadowed beneath the thick southern canopy. But by late morning on April 6, 1862, it had become one of the bloodiest and most fiercely contested places on the continent. This stand wasn't the result of careful strategy. It was a frantic act of survival. Union General Benjamin Prentiss and Brigadier General W.H.L. Wallace hadn't been sent to make a glorious last stand. They were simply trying to hold the line long enough to stop the entire Army of the Tennessee from disintegrating into the Tennessee River. From their position nestled along a sunken wagon road, Prentiss's men braced themselves. As Confederate regiments advanced, they were funneled toward this narrow thicket, where volleys of musket fire erupted like rolling thunder. One soldier wrote in his diary, "The bullets came like a swarm of hornets," and the name stuck, the Hornet's Nest. It wasn't just a nickname. It was a place where time seemed to stretch. Some soldiers reported firing their rifles until the barrels burned their palms. Others ran out of ammunition and scavenged from fallen comrades. Smoke clung low in the trees. Men screamed, not always from wounds but from panic. And yet, the Union line held, hour after hour. The Confederates, desperate to punch through, threw themselves into the meat grinder again and again. At least a dozen frontal assaults were made on the Hornets' nest, many without coordination. Command confusion was rife. The Confederate battle plan had unraveled shortly after sunrise, and now smaller commands attacked almost independently, often unsure of what lay beyond the smoke ahead of them. One of the Confederate soldiers, Private Sam Watkins of the 1st Tennessee, later wrote that it was like trying to storm hell with a pocket knife. Elsewhere across the battlefield, the chaos was just as palpable. To the east, along a muddy trail now known to history as the Bloody Pond, the fight had taken on a different kind of desperation. This small body of water, no bigger than a modern swimming pool, became the only available source of water for hundreds of wounded men. They crawled through mud and blood, many dragging shattered limbs behind them, just to reach it. Union and Confederate alike, some already half dead, dipped canteens or simply plunged their faces into the murky water. The ground around the pond turned crimson. Bodies lay across one another like broken dolls. Some lived, most didn't. One account, from a Confederate officer who later walked past the site, described the pond as rippling with crimson shadows. Some of the wounded glowed in the dark that night. That detail came from years later, but it likely began here. During the grim hours following battle, soldiers would later claim that certain wounds emitted a soft blue-green luminescence. It wasn't some divine sign. Modern science points to photorhabdous luminescence, a rare bioluminescent bacterium found in soil and carried by nematodes. The conditions of Shiloh, muddy terrain, open wounds, and long exposure, may have created an environment where this glow appeared. Strangely, the bacteria may have saved lives. It killed off other, more deadly microbes. Soldiers with glowing wounds often survived when others didn't. In folklore, it became known as the Angel's Glow, a battlefield miracle, or maybe just the quiet resilience of nature amid destruction. By early afternoon, Confederate generals had grown frustrated with the Hornets' nest. They simply could not break it through frontal assaults, so they decided to encircle it. Artillery was dragged through the woods, dozens of cannons, pulled by men and horses who slipped and cursed in the churned earth. Around 50 field guns were finally positioned to pound the Union position from 3 sides. The thicket turned into a blazing inferno of grapeshot and cannonballs. W.H.L. Wallace, a man respected for his composure under pressure, stood calmly amidst the hail of iron until he was struck by a shell fragment. His spine shattered. He would die 3 days later. Prentiss, now cut off entirely, knew the position couldn't hold. Around 5:30 in the evening, he surrendered, along with 2,200 men. It was the largest mass surrender of Union troops until the fall of Harper's Ferry later in the war. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Their stubborn stand bought Grant the hours he needed to rally his remaining forces along the riverbank and prepare for what would come next. Across the field, the Confederates had won ground, but at staggering cost. Many of their units were shattered, their lines disorganized, their men exhausted and dehydrated. They had fought hard, but not efficiently. The early momentum of the morning had bled away into a grinding stalemate. And though they had pushed the Union army back toward the river, they had failed to destroy it. By nightfall, the cries of the wounded echoed through the trees. The fog of powder smoke was joined by mist from the river. Campfires flickered along the ridge, casting long shadows over heaps of bodies. Somewhere in the dark, wild hogs, drawn by the scent, rooted among the fallen. There's something chilling about the scale of it. We're so used to thinking of history in clean lines and bullet points, dates, names, movements. But here, at Shiloh, you can almost hear the confusion. You can feel the suffocation of noise, the disbelief, the aching, crawling dread that must have overtaken the men on both sides as the sun dipped behind the treetops. A Confederate private wrote later, "We could not bury our dead that night. They lay where they fell, with eyes open to the stars." Some Union soldiers sat in silence, clutching their rifles, too tired to speak. Others waited for orders that never came, blinking into the darkness. The steamboats from the north, slow and solemn, churned down the river, bringing reinforcements for Grant, quietly, without fanfare. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the bloody pond reflected moonlight, rippling faintly over the still water. The gunfire had begun to fade, not because the battle was won, but because exhaustion was beginning to settle across the fields, like the smoke that hung low over the shattered ground. It was mid-afternoon on April 6, 1862, and the Confederate High Command still believed they were winning. But somewhere behind the tunnels, near a shallow ravine called the Valley of Death, one of the South's greatest hopes quietly bled out beneath a tree. Albert Sidney Johnston, tall, dignified, with a presence that many said calmed those around him, was no longer issuing orders. He was slumped in his saddle, unaware at first that the damage had been done. The bullet had struck behind his right knee, severing the popliteal artery. A simple wound, it might seem, not to the chest, not to the head, but deadly nonetheless. There were no arteries more treacherous in a war with no tourniquets, no trauma units. He may have felt it as a sting, nothing more. His boot had filled with blood. Still, he continued to give commands, riding among his men. It was his personal staff he noticed at first. His face had grown pale. His leg was limp. A Confederate staff officer named Colonel William Preston tried to help him dismount. "General, are you wounded?" he asked. Johnston, with calm detachment, whispered, "Yes, and I fear seriously." He collapsed a moment later. There had been no surgeon nearby, no stretcher bearers. The general who Jefferson Davis believed to be the South's best battlefield commander died under a cluster of trees near the front line, in a place now called the Death Site. He was 59 years old. What's quietly tragic is how preventable it was. Johnston had sent away his personal physician earlier that day, telling him to go tend to the wounded. Perhaps he believed he was untouchable, or maybe just too focused on the work of command to worry about himself. One of his aides later said that Johnston likely didn't even feel the full force of the wound, due to nerve damage from an old dueling injury. His leg had been partially numb for years. He may have been bleeding to death without even realizing it. And so, command passed to General P.G.T. Beauregard. Beauregard had been further back, overseeing the battlefield from Shiloh Church. When news of Johnston's death reached him, his reaction was quiet, almost stunned. They buried the body that evening beneath an oak tree, temporarily, under the cover of dusk. It would later be moved with full honors. But in that moment, the Southern High Command had little time to mourn. The difference in leadership was immediately felt. Johnston was known for being decisive, aggressive. Beauregard, by contrast, was more cautious. Some say overly so. It's possible, even likely, that had Johnston lived, he would have pushed his troops to take Pittsburgh Landing before the Union could reorganize. But without him, the offensive began to lose steam. Confederate forces were tired, confused, and increasingly leaderless on the front lines. The death of Johnston wasn't just a blow to morale. It was a strategic rupture. The command chain fractured just as the battle hung in the balance. And yet, in the Confederate camps that evening, there was still a belief that they had won. Beauregard even sent telegrams back to Richmond declaring a complete victory. He had no idea what was coming. As I read through some of the soldiers' letters written after the battle, I noticed a common thread in how they spoke of Johnston's death, not just as a loss of a leader, but almost like the extinguishing of a star. One wrote, "He was like Moses to us. He led us into the fight, and then the Lord took him." Another remarked bitterly that his loss was like losing the battle itself. You have to wonder what Davis thought when the news reached him. He had once said that Johnston was the only general he would trust with his whole heart. The two had been close friends since their West Point days. For Davis, it was a personal blow, and one that may have haunted his decisions in how he handled his generals for the rest of the war. There's a strange kind of silence that follows the death of a great man in the midst of war. The battle doesn't stop. No trumpets call for pause. The wheels keep grinding. And yet, for a brief moment in that tangled Tennessee forest, you can almost imagine a hush falling among those who heard the news. One soldier said that when it spread down the line, men fought on, but with a shadow hanging over their rifles. By the end of that first day, the Confederates had pushed Grant's men dangerously close to the river. They'd captured artillery, wagons, and camps, but the momentum had slowed. There was no final hammer blow, and and perhaps there never could have been without Johnston. Some historians believe that Shiloh could have ended very differently had he lived just a few hours longer. Others argue the Union reinforcements were too close, that the Confederacy had overextended itself anyway. But we'll never know. What we do know is that Johnston's death marked a turning point, not just in the battle, but in Confederate fortune across the entire Western theater. And something else lingered in the woods that night, a sense that nothing would be the same, that the war had changed. Grown teeth lost its innocence. Johnston was the highest-ranking officer to die in combat during the entire Civil War. His fall made that point unmistakably clear. The sun dipped low on April 6th, casting long shadows over a battlefield, still humming with the echoes of gunfire, and the heavy breath of exhausted men. The violence of the day had begun to ebb, but the battle was far from over. In the fading light, a strange calm seemed to settle over Pittsburgh Landing. The Confederates, battered and bloodied, began to pull back, convinced they had dealt a decisive blow to Grant's army. General Beauregard, now in command after Johnston's death, allowed himself the luxury of optimism, perhaps even overconfidence, as he sent messages declaring a sweeping victory. It was a belief shared by many in the Confederate camps. Soldiers, some still clutching their muskets stained with the day's grim work, started to tend to their wounds, set up makeshift shelters, and whisper stories of valor and near miracles. But beneath the surface of celebration, a quiet tension lingered. The Union forces, though beaten back, were not defeated. Somewhere beyond the muddy banks of the Tennessee River, the promise of fresh troops stirred the night air, a promise that would soon shift the course of the entire campaign. General Ulysses S. Grant, despite the staggering losses his army had suffered, more than 10,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in a single day, refused to contemplate retreat. This steadfast resolve was not born of arrogance, but of a deep understanding of his army's position and the strategic stakes. Grant's headquarters, a modest tent on the edge of the battlefield, was surrounded by men who shared his grim determination. There was little rest that night, only the quiet buzz of preparations, the steady drum of horses' hooves, and the low murmur of soldiers too weary to sleep. At the river landing, the atmosphere was charged but disciplined. The arrival of reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio was a lifeline. Buell's men had marched hard to reach Grant, covering nearly 40 miles in 2 days. Their arrival was shrouded in near secrecy. Steamboats slipped silently through the night, their decks crowded with fresh, alert troops, ready to step into the chaos. I often think about those hours in the darkness, the stillness punctuated by distant groans of the wounded and the crackle of campfires. It's a stark contrast to the day's turmoil. The sudden shrieks of artillery, the rattle of musket volleys, the cries of the fallen. Night's calm was deceptive, masking the brewing storm that would come with the dawn. For the Confederates, the pause was a moment of reckoning. Beauregard's optimism was tempered by the reality of the battlefield. His men were exhausted, some still clutching their wounds, others haunted by the loss of their leader. The death of Johnston had shaken them deeply, not just in spirit, but in command structure. Communication was patchy, and orders were slow to reach the front lines. The fragile momentum of the morning had given way to uncertainty. Meanwhile, in the Union camps, the night brought a flurry of activity unseen by the enemy. Regiments that had been shattered were reformed, new lines drawn. Artillery crews worked to reposition their guns under the cover of darkness, the glint of cannon barrels catching the firelight. The doctors and nurses, overwhelmed by the flood of casualties, labored tirelessly, their faces etched with fatigue and grim determination. Many wounded lay on the muddy ground, tended by comrades, or left to wait for help that might come too late. One detail that often escapes notice in the broader history of Shiloh is how the landscape itself seemed to breathe with the battle's aftermath. The rain that had begun to fall in the late afternoon soaked the earth, turning it into a quagmire that swallowed men and horses alike. Footprints and bloodstains marked the trails, mingling with shattered branches and discarded weapons. It was a battlefield transformed overnight into a grim memorial, a place where the cost of conflict was etched in every detail. Among the reinforcements arriving, there were men who had never before faced battle, their faces pale but resolute. They came from Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. Farmers, laborers, and tradesmen turned soldiers by circumstance. For many, Shiloh would be their first encounter with the brutal realities of war. Letters sent home that night, and in the days to come, spoke of shock and disbelief, of the overwhelming noise and the sight of comrades falling. A private named William H. McKinley, who would later become President of the United States, was among Buell's reinforcements, though he did not fight at Shiloh. Still, the men he marched alongside carried the weight of what lay ahead. Grant's choice to hold fast, refusing to retreat despite pressure from some of his generals, was a gamble. Some critics at the time questioned his judgment, pointing to the staggering losses and the chaos of the first day. Yet, there was a quiet confidence in Grant's strategy, a belief that with reinforcements, the tide could be turned. It is a testament to the resolve of those commanders and men, weathered by hardship, but unbroken in spirit. Beauregard, for his part, faced a difficult decision. The Confederate forces were stretched thin, their lines frayed and vulnerable. The news of Buell's arrival was uncertain, but rumors and scattered reports suggested that the Union Army was far from defeated. Still, that night, Beauregard held his ground, believing his men could rest and prepare for a final push the following day. There is a remarkable letter from a Confederate soldier named Thomas Jenkins, written in the quiet hours after the fighting paused. He described the eerie stillness that settled over the battlefield, how the men gathered around campfires seemed haunted by the faces of those lost, whispering prayers and memories. He wrote of the river's cold breath and the shadow of death that lingered like a veil. Such words remind us that war is not only measured in tactics and casualties, but in the moments of human vulnerability that it forces upon those who live through it. The night at Shiloh was also a crucible for medical care under fire. Field hospitals, makeshift tents and commandeered buildings were overwhelmed by the volume and severity of injuries. Surgeons faced impossible choices, often forced to perform amputations with limited anesthesia and rudimentary tools. One surgeon, Dr. John B. Porter, recounted how he worked through the night, the cries of the wounded a constant backdrop, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on blood-stained floors. His diary entries reveal a mixture of exhaustion, frustration, and a grim determination to save as many lives as possible despite the chaos. Another less-known detail from that night was the presence of camp followers, women who accompanied the armies to provide nursing, cooking, and other support. Their stories are often lost in the grand narratives of battle, yet they bore witness to the aftermath with compassion and courage. Many worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded and comforting the dying. Their presence a quiet but vital thread woven into the tapestry of the war. As dawn approached on April 7th, the stage was set for a dramatic reversal. The reinforcements were ready, the Union lines rebuilt, and the Confederate forces poised between exhaustion and the pressure of an advancing enemy. The night's calm was merely a pause, a brief breath before the storm would surge once more. It is striking, when reflecting on that night, how fragile victory can be, how the perception of success can hinge on moments just beyond the battlefield's edge. Beauregard's belief in triumph was rooted in what he saw in the fading light, yet it failed to account for the quiet determination building across the river. The battle had not ended, it was evolving. These quiet hours remind me that history is often shaped not just by grand gestures and bold charges, but by patience, endurance, and a willingness to face the unknown with steady resolve. Grant's gamble was not flashy or dramatic, but it was essential. Sometimes, victory requires waiting through the darkness, trusting that dawn will bring a new chance. The morning of April 7th, 1862, arrived with a heavy, misty stillness that seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself was waiting for what was to come. The air was thick and cool, the ground sodden from the previous day's rain, turning the battlefield into a treacherous sea of mud that clung to boots and horses alike. Yet beneath that quiet exterior, a profound shift was unfolding, a change in momentum that few could have predicted as the sun rose over Pittsburgh Landing. The Union Army, battered but not broken, began to stir with renewed purpose. Grant's men, weary from the brutal onslaught of the previous day, were slowly reorganizing, their ranks swelled by the arrival of fresh troops under General Don Carlos Buell. Buell's army had marched tirelessly through the night, covering nearly 40 miles to reach the embattled forces at Shiloh, their boots sinking into the same soaked earth that bore the scars of yesterday's carnage. These fresh soldiers arrived with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve, many seeing their first true taste of war, unaware of the fierce fight that awaited them. It is worth noting how crucial Buell's timely arrival was. Without these reinforcements, Grant's army might have crumbled under the weight of Confederate pressure. Buell's fresh divisions formed a new front, effectively turning the tide. His arrival was not announced with grand fanfare, but rather unfolded quietly. The soft splash of steamboats along the Tennessee River, and the low murmur of marching men signaling a quiet but decisive shift in the battle's balance. General Beauregard, now in command after the death of Albert Sidney Johnston, faced the grim reality of the situation. The Confederate forces had advanced deeply into Union lines on April 6th, but had paid a heavy price in men and morale. Their assault had been fierce but costly, and by morning, exhaustion and dwindling supplies began to weigh heavily. Beauregard was aware that his army was not only fatigued, but increasingly vulnerable. Intelligence was scarce, but reports hinted at Buell's arrival, forcing a difficult choice: to press on and risk total collapse, or to withdraw and regroup. He chose the latter, ordering a retreat toward Corinth, Mississippi, a strategic railroad junction and supply center. The decision to retreat was not taken lightly. Beauregard's army, despite its earlier successes, was fraying at the edges. Communications between units were disjointed, and the strain of constant battle had sapped the men's strength. Many soldiers struggled to hold their lines as the Union counterattack gathered force. Confederate artillery, once a hammer striking at Union positions, found itself under increasing pressure, unable to stem the surge of Buell's and Grant's combined forces. The Union counteroffensive was methodical and relentless. Commanders took advantage of the muddy, broken terrain that had proven a hindrance the day before, using it to channel Confederate troops into vulnerable positions. Artillery was repositioned with remarkable speed under the cover of early morning fog, delivering punishing volleys against the retreating enemy. Infantry units advanced in tighter formations than before, their muskets steady, despite the fatigue, and the distant cries of the wounded still echoing across the fields. One lesser-known fact that often escapes attention is how much the Union commanders had learned overnight about the Confederate tactics. The chaos and confusion that had thrown Grant's army into disarray on the first day became a source of intelligence as captured soldiers and scouts relayed details of Confederate dispositions. This information proved invaluable in planning the counterattack, allowing Union forces to target weak points and avoid costly frontal assaults where possible. Among the Union troops pushing forward, there were moments of quiet heroism that deserve mention. Soldiers who had been near breaking on the previous day found renewed strength in the solidarity of their comrades. Corporal James H. Wilson, writing later to his family, described how men dug into the earth to shield themselves from artillery fire, whispering prayers and encouragement as they pushed the enemy back. The toll was still high, but the mood had shifted from desperation to determination. As the morning wore on, the Confederate lines began to buckle. Beauregard, recognizing the untenable situation, ordered a full withdrawal. The retreat was hasty and fraught with danger. Many Confederate soldiers abandoned their wounded or stragglers, and confusion reigned as units struggled to maintain order in the face of the Union advance. Some artillery pieces were left behind, either because of the mud or the speed of the retreat. This chaotic withdrawal marked a stark contrast to the confident, if costly, advance of the previous day. This retreat toward Corinth was strategic but costly. Corinth was vital as a railroad hub, connecting much of the Confederate Western theater, and its defense was critical for the Confederacy's ability to resist Union incursions into Mississippi and beyond. The loss of ground at Shiloh meant that the Confederates had to fall back to this defensive stronghold, ceding control of the immediate battlefield and the surrounding area to the Union Army. An intriguing detail about the retreat is how some Confederate soldiers used the dense woodland and uneven terrain to their advantage, slipping away in small groups to avoid capture. This guerrilla-like movement allowed many to survive what might have been a disastrous rout. Letters from soldiers like Private Samuel H. Williams reveal the harrowing experience of retreat, describing nights spent hiding in underbrush, evading Union patrols, and the quiet fear of capture or death. The battle's second day demonstrated a marked contrast to the confusion and disarray of the first. The Union Army, under Grant's steady hand and buoyed by Buell's fresh troops, moved with greater coordination and resolve. The transformation was not only tactical but psychological. Soldiers who had faced the terror of surprise attack found themselves now pressing the advantage, reclaiming lost ground, and turning the momentum in a way that would resonate far beyond the immediate battlefield. It is also worth reflecting on how Shiloh exposed the brutal realities of Civil War combat beyond mere statistics. The relentless artillery barrages, the grinding infantry assaults, and the desperate retreats all contributed to a level of carnage previously unseen in American warfare. Yet amid this brutality were acts of compassion and bravery, moments where humanity flickered through the fog of war. One such moment came near a small, unassuming ravine known by soldiers as the Wounded Hollow. Here, under a canopy of trees, medics and volunteers worked tirelessly to tend to the injured. Despite the overwhelming numbers, they employed innovative techniques, including rudimentary triage systems, to prioritize care. The harsh conditions and the absence of sufficient supplies made their efforts heroic acts of endurance. Some surgeons described how they fashioned splints from branches and used whiskey to dull the pain. Their stories remind us that even amid the chaos of battle, life persisted in small, stubborn ways. By midday, the Confederate retreat was complete, and the Union forces had regained control of the battlefield. The cost was staggering. Over 23,000 casualties combined, with thousands dead or wounded on both sides. Yet for the Union, this was a hard-won victory, one that came at a terrible price, but opened the way deeper into the Confederate heartland. What fascinates me is how the men on both sides grappled with the aftermath. Letters, diaries, and memoirs reveal a profound mixture of exhaustion, sorrow, and a dawning awareness that the war ahead would be long and unforgiving. A Confederate soldier named Elijah P. Harris wrote of the cold sting of defeat, mingled with pride in his comrades' bravery, while Union Private Henry T. Stanton spoke of the hollow silence after the storm, where the earth itself seemed to mourn. This day at Shiloh was not merely a battle of tactics and manpower. It was a test of endurance, faith, and will. It forced commanders and soldiers alike to reckon with the terrible costs of a nation divided, and the grim reality that no ground would be won without sacrifice. The immediate aftermath of Shiloh unfolded beneath a heavy, almost suffocating silence. The roar of artillery had faded, leaving behind only the distant, uneven footsteps of weary soldiers, and the low moans of the wounded scattered across fields now soaked with rain and blood. News of the battle rippled outwards slowly at first, then with growing urgency, stirring the nation into a collective, uneasy reckoning with the brutal reality of what had transpired. Few conflicts before Shiloh had exacted such a staggering toll in so short a time. More than 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in those 2 days, a number that eclipsed the combined American casualties from the Revolutionary War through the Mexican-American War. For many, the sheer scale was incomprehensible. Newspapers north and south struggled to convey the magnitude without descending into hysteria or despair. Headlines in New York and Philadelphia spoke of the slaughter at Shiloh, while southern papers wrestled with the painful necessity of retreat, describing it as a tactical withdrawal from a battlefield that had been, until then, full of promise. The shock extended beyond the pages of the press. Families anxiously awaited news, only to receive fragmented or contradictory reports. Soldiers' letters home, filled with a mixture of grim resolve and disbelief, filtered through the fog of war. Private Isaac Miller, of the 18th Illinois, wrote to his sister that the fields looked as if the devil had passed through, with men lying still, and the smell of earth and blood thick in the air. Such first-hand accounts helped shape a narrative of war, unlike anything the American public had yet faced. Political leaders found themselves in a difficult position, trying to make sense of a conflict that seemed suddenly more savage and protracted than anyone had imagined. Union General Ulysses S. Grant became a lightning rod for both criticism and support. Many questioned how his army could have been caught so unprepared, criticizing the camp's lax security and the initial disorder. Yet others recognized the resolve he showed by refusing to retreat and rallying the army to fight on, despite overwhelming odds. It was a contentious moment, with calls for his removal echoing in Washington, countered by President Abraham Lincoln's famously resolute response, "I can't spare this man. He fights." That simple phrase underscored the trust placed in Grant's grit and determination, qualities that would come to define his legacy. On the Confederate side, the retreat to Corinth weighed heavily on commanders and men alike. Corinth was not merely a fallback position, but a crucial hub of railroads and supply lines that connected much of the Western theater. Holding it was essential to maintaining Confederate control over large swaths of territory. Yet the loss at Shiloh had dealt a blow to Confederate hopes of halting the Union advance. General Beauregard himself grappled with mixed feelings, pride in the bravery shown, yet the bitter sting of losing ground and men, whose sacrifices felt almost in vain. There is an often overlooked detail about the impact Shiloh had on the morale of both armies. While the Union emerged with a hard-fought victory, the price was so heavy that it dampened the initial enthusiasm for the war in many northern communities. Recruitment and public support experienced a subtle but real decline, as the romantic notions of swift victory gave way to a grimmer understanding of war's realities. In the South, the retreat sowed seeds of doubt, but also hardened the resolve to resist, setting the stage for a protracted and bloody struggle in the Western theater. The name Shiloh itself came to carry a somber irony. Derived from a Hebrew word often translated as place of peace, it was etched into the collective consciousness as a site of unimaginable violence and loss. This paradox haunted many who survived and remembered the battle. A Union chaplain, Reverend Charles Garrett, wrote in his journal of "A land once peaceful, now soaked in the blood of brothers, where the silence tells the tale louder than any cannon." That quiet reflection captured the emotional weight that Shiloh cast long after the guns fell silent. Even among the soldiers who lived through those days, the memories were etched deeply and often painfully. Many wrote of the confusion, the terror, and the fleeting moments of camaraderie that buoyed them through the worst. Sergeant Thomas H. Reynolds recalled the moments after the battle ended, describing how men wandered among the dead and wounded, some unable to speak, others whispering prayers or songs to comfort the dying. In these quiet hours, the battlefield transformed from a scene of carnage into a place of mourning, healing, and sometimes bitter questioning. The medical response to Shiloh, while heroic in its effort, revealed the harsh limitations of Civil War medicine. Field hospitals, often little more than tents hastily erected near the front lines, were overwhelmed. Surgeons worked tirelessly, performing amputations with crude instruments and limited anesthesia. The mortality rate among the wounded was devastating, exacerbated by infections and the lack of sanitary conditions. Yet there were moments of astonishing ingenuity. Some doctors experimented with early antiseptics, and the use of what was called angel's glow began to draw attention. A strange bioluminescent glow observed on some soldiers' wounds at night, which modern research suggests may have been caused by bacteria that helped prevent infection. Though unrecognized at the time, such phenomena hinted at the complex intersection of nature and medicine amid the horrors of war. The aftermath also saw the grim task of burial and remembrance. Burial crews worked under difficult conditions to inter the dead, often in mass graves or unmarked pits. The sheer number of casualties overwhelmed local communities and stretched resources thin. Many soldiers were laid to rest near where they fell, and in some cases, identification was impossible, leaving families with the heartbreaking uncertainty of their loved ones' fate. The creation of cemeteries and memorials would come later, but the immediate period following the battle was marked by sorrow and silence. One particularly moving aspect that often goes unmentioned is the presence and contribution of African American laborers and camp followers. Though not combatants, many were pressed into service, helping care for the wounded, burying the dead, and ferrying supplies. Their stories, too, are woven into the fabric of Shiloh's legacy. One nurse, Harriet Williams, wrote of how these men and women worked alongside surgeons, often risking their own health and safety in the process. Their efforts, while largely unrecognized at the time, added a vital layer of humanity amid the chaos. The impact of Shiloh extended beyond the battlefield and the immediate political and military consequences. It fundamentally altered how the nation viewed the war itself. Gone were the days of romantic notions of swift and glorious conflict. Instead, Shiloh revealed the grim, grinding reality that would come to define much of the Civil War. A long, bitter struggle, demanding tremendous sacrifice and endurance. This reckoning shaped not only military strategy, but the collective psyche of a nation divided. It is fascinating, looking back, to consider how the voices of ordinary soldiers and civilians helped shape the memory of Shiloh. Their letters, diaries, and memoirs provide a mosaic of experiences, fear and hope, loss and resilience, that bring the battle to life beyond the statistics. These personal narratives remind us that behind every number was a human story, one of courage, pain, and the yearning for peace amid chaos. As I think about Shiloh, I am struck by how this single, bloody encounter became a mirror reflecting the broader tragedy of the Civil War. It was a moment when America confronted itself in the most brutal way imaginable, forced to recognize the costs of division and the price of unity. Yet, amid the devastation, there were seeds of something else. A growing determination to endure, to rebuild, and to remember. The roar of battle may have faded after those first brutal days, but the stories of Shiloh didn't end with the final cannon fire or the retreating columns of soldiers. Beneath the broad strokes of strategy and command decisions, there lived countless quieter narratives, voices rarely heard in the grand histories, yet no less vital to understanding the true human cost of that April conflict in 1862. Letters scribbled hastily by young soldiers, dirt smudged and stained with tears or sweat, reveal a world beyond the gunfire and smoke. Many of these men were far from home, some barely out of their teens, grappling with fear and hope in equal measure. One such letter, written by a Union private named Samuel Hopkins, captures the strange mix of horror and camaraderie that defined those days. He described how, even amid the chaos, men shared their last crusts of bread or whispered prayers beneath the shaking branches of the woods near Pittsburgh Landing. "We fought like madmen, but when the night fell, it was silence that ruled, save for the groans of the wounded and the soft sobbing of a friend lost," he wrote. While the soldiers took center stage, there were others caught in Shiloh's wake, enslaved African Americans, camp followers, and freedmen who worked as laborers and nurses. Their experiences have been often overlooked, but their presence was undeniable. One such figure was Harriet, a young woman who accompanied the Union forces as a nurse and washerwoman. In her brief journal, she recounted the endless procession of wounded men arriving at makeshift hospitals, many crying out for their mothers or clutching fragments of letters from home. Harriet's reflections provide a rare, intimate glimpse into the battlefield's softer, if equally harrowing, side. Her account reminds us that war's violence is not confined to soldiers alone. One of the more curious and somewhat hopeful tales from Shiloh comes from a phenomenon that baffled many at the time, what soldiers called angel's glow. Several wounded men reported their injuries emitting a faint, eerie light in the dark of night. At first, many thought this to be a supernatural sign, perhaps a blessing in the midst of despair. Today, science offers a fascinating explanation. Bioluminescent bacteria, harmless to humans, colonized the wounds and likely prevented deadly infections by outcompeting more dangerous germs. This strange natural miracle may have quietly saved many lives, even as surgeons raced against the clock to stop hemorrhaging limbs or stave off infection in poorly sterilized tents. Medical care at Shiloh, despite any natural wonders, was overwhelmed. Surgeons worked tirelessly under the most primitive conditions, often lacking anesthesia or proper tools. Amputations were frequent, and many were performed without effective pain relief, a fact that horrifies modern listeners, but was tragically routine in the 1860s. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, who would later revolutionize battlefield medicine, was not yet on the scene, and the toll was devastating. The wounded were crammed into tents, barns, and even private homes, their groans mingling with the ceaseless buzz of flies and the damp, unrelenting smell of blood and earth. One surgeon's diary entry captures the grim reality. The stench of death and suffering is everywhere. Men scream for mercy, and all I can offer is a cold blade. Burial parties face their own grim task. The sheer volume of dead, over 3,000, 400 Union, and nearly 2,700 Confederate soldiers, meant many graves were shallow, hastily dug, and unmarked. Some bodies were left in the woods, others piled in mass graves, their names lost to time. It is said that for weeks after the battle, the ground around Pittsburgh Landing remained disturbed, and wildflowers struggled to bloom where the blood had soaked deep into the soil. Stories passed down speak of farmers nearby who would stumble upon bones or remnants of uniforms long after the guns had fallen silent. These ghosts of Shiloh are reminders that war's cost extends beyond the immediate violence. Trauma of a different kind haunted many survivors. Letters home often hint at nightmares, shaking fits, or a profound weariness that settled deep in the bones. One soldier, James McClure, wrote to his wife of the haunting shadows that followed him, describing how, even in quiet moments, the faces of fallen comrades flickered in his mind. This kind of psychological scar was common, though rarely acknowledged at the time, and what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder was simply endured in silence. The war was not just a series of battles, but a slow, grinding erosion of human spirit for many. Despite this heavy human toll, life at Shiloh also showed flickers of resilience and even humor. Soldiers found small comforts and shared stories, jokes, and moments of tenderness. One Confederate soldier, writing after the battle, recounted how a group of men found an abandoned cherry pie near a ravaged camp and celebrated the rare treat with quiet laughter. Such moments, brief as they were, remind us that amidst destruction, the threads of humanity persist. The voices of women at Shiloh, though rarely spotlighted, also resonate in scattered records. Camp followers provided vital support, nursing the wounded and tending to basic needs, often putting themselves at great risk. Their presence was sometimes controversial, as commanders struggled to maintain order, but their contributions were essential. These women bore witness to the rawest moments of suffering and endurance, their strength often unsung. At the same time, the landscape itself seemed to carry the weight of those who fought and died there. The dense Tennessee woods, with their towering oaks and tangled undergrowth, absorbed the cries and chaos. The nearby Owl Creek, named for its haunting nighttime calls, ran dark and thick from the blood and mud. These woods, once serene, became a living monument to the struggle, a place where history's quiet whispers persist amid the rustling leaves. One cannot ignore the enduring cultural impact of these forgotten voices. The raw letters, personal diaries, and oral testimonies have since shaped how historians and descendants understand Shiloh, beyond the numbers and names etched on monuments. They remind us that history is not solely the story of generals and battles, but of individuals caught in the tides of events far greater than themselves. There is a striking letter from a Confederate private, Charles Everett, whose poetic words linger in memory. He wrote of the paradox of Shiloh, a place where brother fought brother, where the soil drank deep of blood, yet still yearned for peace. His reflection captures the profound tragedy of civil war, a conflict that tore families, communities, and the nation itself apart. Such voices challenge us to listen beyond the strategic narratives and to honor the human experience at the heart of history. In the silence that followed Shiloh, many soldiers struggled to piece together their shattered lives. Some returned home, forever changed, while others re-enlisted, driven by duty or despair. The battlefield itself would remain a place of memory, sorrow, and sometimes pilgrimage for decades. Veterans met quietly under the shade of ancient trees to share stories, sometimes in tears, often in reverence. This mosaic of forgotten stories, the glowing wounds, the whispered prayers, the nurses' tireless hands, the burial crew's somber labor, forms the beating heart of Shiloh's legacy. It is a legacy not of glory alone, but of human endurance, frailty, and the enduring hope for peace amid the ruins of war. The voices of Shiloh remind us that history is alive, layered, and always more complex than the dates and facts might suggest. The Battle of Shiloh left an indelible mark, not only on the men who fought there, but on the very nature of the Civil War itself. When the echoes of musket fire and cannon blasts finally faded, the conflict that unfolded in those Tennessee woods in April 1862 had shattered illusions on both sides. It became painfully clear that this war would be neither brief nor gentle. The sheer scale of casualties, over 23,000 combined killed, wounded, or missing in just 2 days, was a staggering wake-up call for the nation. Before Shiloh, many Americans had clung to the hope that the rebellion could be crushed quickly, that decisive victories might bring an end to the bloodshed with minimal suffering. Instead, Shiloh exposed the brutal reality that modern war could be slow, grinding, and devastatingly costly. The battlefield became a grim symbol of the new age of total war, where entire armies faced each other in prolonged, bitter contests. Strategically, Shiloh opened the gates for the Union's deeper advance into the Confederate heartland. With the Confederate forces pushed back, the path was cleared for General Grant's army to move toward Corinth, Mississippi, a vital rail junction. Controlling Corinth meant severing one of the Confederacy's crucial supply and communication lines in the Western Theater. The eventual fall of Corinth later in May 1862 was a critical step in the Union's campaign to split the South and gain full control of the Mississippi River, a goal that culminated with the siege of Vicksburg the following year. Shiloh, then, was more than a bloody clash. It was a turning point that redefined the war's geography and momentum. Grant's reputation, forever linked with this battle, emerged from the ordeal with a mixture of controversy and admiration. In the immediate aftermath, his critics were loud. Newspapers in the North questioned how his forces had been caught so off guard, and some called for his removal. But President Abraham Lincoln famously stood by Grant, saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights." That endorsement was crucial. Grant's dogged resilience, his refusal to consider retreat, even when his army was pushed nearly to the brink, revealed the traits that would eventually make him the Union's most successful general. Interestingly, Shiloh also forced military leaders on both sides to rethink their approach to warfare. The chaotic nature of the battle, with its surprise attacks and fragmented lines, highlighted the need for better communication and reconnaissance. Confederate commanders, grappling with the loss of General Albert Sidney Johnston, faced a painful realization that their strategy in the West required greater coordination. Meanwhile, Union forces began to improve camp security and field medicine, seeking to avoid the costly mistakes of Shiloh. The battle also revealed the stark contrast between expectation and reality for soldiers and civilians alike. Many had imagined war as a series of heroic charges and quick victories. Instead, Shiloh presented a grinding, messy, and often terrifying experience. The terrain itself, dense woods, ravines, and creeks, became a natural labyrinth that both hindered and shaped combat, turning every advance into a perilous endeavor. Soldiers described the confusion and fear they felt as they stumbled through the thick underbrush, unable to see friend from foe, hearing the crackle of gunfire suddenly erupt close by, then silenced by death. One fascinating aspect that emerges when studying Shiloh is how it influenced public perception of the war's horror. The scale of death and suffering shocked many at home, challenging romanticized notions of battle. Newspapers printed detailed casualty lists and personal stories, which brought the human cost into sharp relief. This shift in public consciousness contributed to a growing wariness and fatigue that would shape Northern and Southern societies as the conflict dragged on for years. The Union's experience at Shiloh spurred developments in battlefield medicine, although progress was slow and often painful. The medical practices of the day, while primitive by modern standards, began to evolve in response to the overwhelming number of wounded. Ambulance corps became more organized, and the system of triage, prioritizing treatment based on injury severity, started to take shape. The realization that infection and poor sanitation were killing more soldiers than battle wounds themselves pushed surgeons and nurses to advocate for better hygiene. These lessons, born in the crucible of Shiloh's hospitals and field tents, would be refined and applied in later campaigns. In the months after the battle, the Union Army implemented stricter camp discipline and scouting procedures. The surprise Confederate attack at Shiloh was a costly lesson in vulnerability. Commanders understood the importance of vigilance, patrols, and fortifications to prevent a repeat. This focus on security would prove essential in future operations, and reflected a maturation of military strategy on the Union side. Confederate leaders, meanwhile, wrestled with the aftermath of the loss. General Beauregard, who succeeded Johnston, was tasked with holding the Western Front. Yet the Confederate position steadily weakened as Union forces pressed forward. The defeat at Shiloh forced a reassessment of defensive tactics and underscored the growing challenge of sustaining the Southern war effort against better resourced Northern armies. The psychological impact of losing one of the war's most respected commanders, Johnston, was keenly felt. His death was not just a tactical loss, but a symbolic blow to Confederate morale. Beyond the immediate military consequences, Shiloh left a legacy in the collective memory of the war. It was the first major battle to reveal the full scale of carnage that modern, industrialized warfare could inflict. The names of the fallen were inscribed on countless monuments, yet many more remained anonymous, buried in unmarked graves beneath the forest floor. The battlefield itself eventually became a site of remembrance, as later generations sought to preserve the scars of history and honor the sacrifices made there. One cannot ignore how the battle's lessons echoed far beyond the fields of Tennessee. The idea that this war would be short and decisive was forever dispelled. Shiloh heralded a prolonged conflict of attrition, marked by staggering losses and a brutal calculus of human cost. It shaped the strategies and mentalities of commanders on both sides, forcing them to adapt to a war that was no longer about single engagements, but sustained campaigns across vast and difficult terrain. In quieter moments, when reflecting on Shiloh, I often think about the ordinary men who found themselves caught in the tides of history. Not generals or politicians, but the privates, the medics, the laborers who experienced the war's chaos firsthand. Their stories, preserved in letters and diaries, offer a window into the resilience of the human spirit amid unimaginable suffering. It is in these voices that Shiloh's true legacy endures, reminding us that behind every statistic lies a story of hope, fear, and endurance. The ground at Shiloh, where so many fell amid the chaos and carnage, did not simply fade into obscurity with time. Instead, it slowly transformed into a place of remembrance, reflection, and often somber pilgrimage. Today, as the soft winds whisper through the trees that stand sentinel over the battlefield, visitors tread paths where soldiers once fought desperately, where the earth still seems to hold the echoes of gunfire and the murmur of anguished voices. The establishment of the Shiloh National Military Park in 1894 was a pivotal moment in preserving this hallowed ground. It was among the first of its kind, created with the express purpose of honoring those who had fought and died there. The effort was not without its difficulties. The land had been ravaged by the fighting, then left to nature's reclaiming hand for decades, and transforming it into a site of historical memory required both reverence and practical care. Over time, monuments, plaques, and markers were placed thoughtfully, tracing the lines of battle and commemorating units, generals, and individual acts of bravery. The park became a classroom without walls, a place where visitors could begin to grasp the scale and intensity of the conflict that played out across this very terrain. Despite its significance, Shiloh's place in public memory has often been overshadowed by battles further east. Gettysburg, Antietam, and even later confrontations such as Chickamauga and Chattanooga seem to dominate the popular imagination when it comes to Civil War lore. Yet, for those who study the war closely, Shiloh remains a profound turning point, a moment when the brutal reality of a long, grinding conflict truly revealed itself in all its harshness. There is a certain quietness to Shiloh that almost belies the violence that once tore through it. The battle was so bloody, so sudden, and so intense that the survivors carried the weight of its memory long after the guns fell silent. Veterans recalled the battle not just in terms of tactics or territorial gains, but through the trauma of the sights and sounds that had haunted their dreams. One Union soldier, writing years later, described the Hornet's Nest as a place where the air was thick with smoke, cries, and the constant dreadful hammering of musket fire, words that still give a sense of the relentless pressure that gripped the men caught there. Historians over the decades have revisited Shiloh with a mixture of admiration and critique. Ulysses S. Grant, once criticized harshly for his army's surprise and the terrible losses, has been reappraised as a commander of remarkable fortitude. His steadfast refusal to retreat, even when the situation looked dire, became emblematic of his leadership style. Grant's calm under fire and willingness to absorb punishment in order to preserve his forces contributed directly to his later successes in the war and his eventual rise to the presidency. Meanwhile, Albert Sidney Johnston's death remains one of the great what-ifs of the Civil War. A respected and capable leader, his loss was not only a blow to Confederate morale, but a strategic setback that arguably altered the battle's course. Some modern scholars speculate that had Johnston survived and maintained his command, the Confederates might have mounted a more effective defense or pursued a more cohesive offensive, possibly changing the trajectory of the Western theater. The battlefield itself offers a rare, tangible connection to the past. Visitors walking the trails encounter landmarks like the Bloody Pond, where the blood of so many turned the water a deep, unsettling red, or the Sunken Road, a natural depression that became a deadly killing ground. These sites serve as silent reminders that history is not just words on a page, but places shaped by human lives and losses. Reenactments and commemorations have also helped keep Shiloh alive in the public consciousness. Each year, descendants and enthusiasts gather to remember the fallen and to educate new generations about the battle's significance. These gatherings often take on a somber tone, as participants grapple with the realities of a conflict that pitted countrymen against each other in a fight that reshaped the nation. In recent years, archaeological studies and battlefield preservation efforts have deepened our understanding of Shiloh. Using modern technology, researchers have uncovered artifacts and battlefield layouts that provide new insights into troop movements, logistics, and soldier experiences. These findings remind us that history is always evolving. New discoveries can challenge long-held assumptions or bring fresh perspectives to familiar stories. One aspect that continues to resonate is the human cost. The thousands who died, were wounded, or lived with scars both visible and hidden. The battlefield is a silent memorial to their sacrifice, a testament to the brutal price of civil war. In many ways, Shiloh serves as a somber lesson on the costs of division, the complexities of leadership, and the enduring need to remember, so that such violence might one day be avoided. As you imagine the scenes of April 1862, the dense forests shattered by artillery, the exhausted men struggling through mud and smoke, the moments of courage and despair, you can't help but feel the weight of history pressing, gently but insistently, against the present. It is a reminder that history is not only about dates and outcomes, but about people whose lives were forever altered. When walking through Shiloh today, one might pause quietly beneath the canopy of trees and reflect on the resilience of those who fought and survived, and on the generations who chose to remember them. The peacefulness that now cloaks the battlefield stands in stark contrast to the tumult of those 2 days, yet it carries its own power, a testament to memory, healing, and the slow passage of time. Before we part tonight, I find myself thinking about the fragility of peace, how easily it can be shattered, and yet how deeply humanity yearns to rebuild and move forward. Battles like Shiloh remind us that history is never far beneath the surface of our daily lives, shaping the world we live in and the stories we tell. Thank you for sharing this time, listening closely to a chapter of history filled with both tragedy and resilience. If you found this journey meaningful, consider liking and subscribing for more quiet stories that reveal the depths beneath the surface of history's moments. Until next time, may your night be restful, and your curiosity always softly kindled. Good night.